Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for tuning in today for our book club author talk with Ross Perlin. My name is Katie Peace, and I'm the Director of Communications for the Preservation League of New York State. If you've made your way to this webinar but are not familiar with the League, we empower all New Yorkers to use historic preservation to enrich their communities, protect their heritage, and build a sustainable future. Our nonprofit does this work in every corner of New York State and in many different ways, including providing grants that jumpstart preservation projects. We advocate for preservation at the local, state, and federal level. We provide technical assistance and collaborate with local colleagues across the state. We award excellence in historic preservation and draw attention to at-risk historic sites. And we also offer virtual programs like this one. And I do want to say thank you to our sponsor for our Preservation Book Club events, the Peggy and Roger G. Gary Charitable Trust, and of course to all of our members and donors. You all make this work possible, so thank you so much. And so the reason we are here today to talk about Language City, the Fight to Preserve Endangered Mother Tongues in New York by Ross Perlin. This is a captivating portrait of contemporary New York City through 6 speakers of little-known and overlooked languages, diving into the incredible history of the most linguistically diverse place ever to have existed on the planet. Half of all 7,000 plus human languages may disappear over the next century, and because many have never been recorded, when they're gone, it will be forever. Ross Perlin, a linguist and co-director of the Manhattan-based nonprofit Endangered Language Alliance, is racing against time to map little-known languages across the most linguistically diverse city in history, contemporary New York. In Language City, Perlin recounts the unique history of immigration that shaped the city and follows 6 remarkable yet ordinary speakers of endangered languages deep into their communities to learn how they are maintaining and reviving their languages against overwhelming odds. Perlin also dives deep into their languages, taking us on a fascinating tour of unusual grammars, rare sounds, and powerful cultural histories from all over the world. And truly, this book was so fascinating. So if you have not had a chance to read it yet, I really recommend that you do. A little bit about the author. Ross Perlin is a linguist, writer, and translator. He currently serves as co-director of the Endangered Language Alliance, managing research projects on map-making, documentation, policy, and public programming for urban linguistic diversity. He's written for The New York Times, The Guardian, Harper's, N+1, and is author of the book Intern Nation: How to Learn Nothing and Earn Little in the Brave New Economy. Perlin was a New Arizona Fellow at New America, and he's a native New Yorker. And I'm very, very glad to welcome Ross Perlin with us today. As I said, if you have questions during the presentation, please drop them in the Q&A box, and my colleague Caitlin Meives, our Director of Preservation, will join Ross in conversation after his presentation. And a couple more words about the book and why we're so excited to welcome Ross here today to talk about it. Obviously, the Preservation League of New York State is deeply invested in the preservation of our built environment, of our communities, neighborhoods, landscapes that make up the cultural fabric of our state. But this idea of intangible heritage, cultural heritage, language is so much a part of that. And it's a really particular and interesting example of how people feel connected to their cultures, to their communities. And this book really does such a beautiful job kind of doing a deep dive into something that can be very academic, but makes it so human. And it was just a pleasure to read. Super, super fascinating. And the work that Ross and his team at the Endangered Language Alliance are doing is really wonderful. And there he is.
Hi, I'm so sorry.
So I will stop talking now. I will let him talk, and he will
Uh,
tell us all about what he's doing.
for me, as a linguist working on language preservation and language revitalization, it's really interesting to think about connections with the world of historic preservation that the League has been involved in for so long. Language sort of falls into the world of, I suppose, intangible heritage preservation, but it's not something that I think linguists or language activists have really thought that much about. There are enough kind of questions and challenges we've been grappling with in terms of the details of our work with language that I think we haven't really learned enough from other fields about what preservation means. So I have some slides which I was going to share, and maybe we'll be able to share if my if the Zoom starts working out on my computer. But just to kind of give a really kind of high-level overview of this new book, Language City: The Fight to Preserve Endangered Mother Tongues in New York. It's the paperback of which is actually just out today officially. This is a book about the most linguistically diverse city, not just in the world, but in the history of the world, which is contemporary New York. And it actually sort of extends to not only the city, but it's actually the wider metropolitan area, and it's really a book about languages and cities more broadly. And it's about the past, present, and future of this place of linguistic diversity. We at the Endangered Language Alliance, where I work, have mapped the presence of over 700 languages in the New York area, 700 and counting. There are undoubtedly many that we don't yet know about, and that is approximately 10% of the world's total. So linguists, to the extent that we can enumerate and individuate languages, which is always questionable because of the complexities of what's a language, what's a dialect, and the relatively kind of or under-documented state of so many languages, talk about there being something like 7,000 languages in the world, of which as many as half today are considered endangered. Now, what does that mean? There's a whole kind of emerging sort of field of trying to understand language endangerment, but it's partly about the number of speakers. So as many as half of the world's languages have fewer than 10,000 speakers at this point. But even more so, it's about intergenerational transmission. And it's about, whether a language is getting passed on to children, what kinds of domains it's being used in. Is it used beyond, just the home? Can it be used in a bunch of different sort of social domains of life, work, livelihood, cultural, religious, and other practices? And for a whole host of reasons that we won't sort of go into in detail, more and more of the world's languages are not being passed on to children, and really a small number of languages are taking over for complex historical reasons. The spread of empires, the spread of nation states, the spread of markets, urbanization and migration have also played their role as well. As people leave their kind of traditional homelands, language is often something that's hard for people to sort of take with them. But this book and the research that we've been doing in New York over the last 15 years at the Endangered Language Alliance is about how actually cities, and especially cities like New York, where people are coming from all over the world, can be places where linguistic diversity can thrive. And that it may seem paradoxical that just at the moment when as many as half of the world's languages are endangered, cities like New York are becoming more linguistically diverse than ever before. So there has never been such a collection of indigenous, minority, and primarily oral languages. Most of the world's languages are traditionally oral. Writing is a pretty recent technology for almost all languages, which, speakers or signers, because there are something like 200 sign languages as well, that from all over the globe. But basically, there's a whole new set of opportunities that come about when you have this kind of urban linguistic diversity. On the one hand, the threats are just as intense, and language shift is a universal feature of urban life and part of New York's history, as I'll talk about a little bit. But at the same time, there is a real opportunity as speakers of these languages arrive here. And part of that has been the opportunity for linguists and speakers to work together on common projects to document languages in the first place, because it's precisely the most endangered languages that are the least well documented and about which we know the least. So things that we might kind of assume exist for every language, like dictionaries or grammatical descriptions, archival materials, collections of texts, really don't exist for a large number of languages. Something like 2,000 out of the world's 7,000 languages, there's nothing more than a word list, a bare bones list of words, maybe glossed into another language of wider communication, but nothing like a dictionary, nothing like a a full book even, or high quality audio or video recordings. So the book is kind of a few different things. On the one hand, it's a linguistic history of New York, and the sort of question of how the most linguistically diverse city came to be. And that story begins with Lenape, the original language of this land, and actually a much wider area. And Lenape itself is very much an endangered language today, with really one native speaker who's in her 80s, who I visit briefly in the book. And she's actually in Ontario, Canada, which is Southwest Ontario has become a kind of last stronghold for Lenape. The history of Lenape displacement and dispossession means that today Lenape groups, the organized Lenape groups, are basically in Oklahoma, Ontario, and Wisconsin. Although closer to home, there are people who are rediscovering and embracing their Lenape kind of roots or identity. Lenape hasn't been sort of actively spoken in the New York area for a few centuries because of the patterns of displacement that began with the arrival of the Dutch. Yet Lenape is very much part of the story, and another part of the book where I profile sort of these 6 speakers, one of whom is a Lenape revivalist from Ontario who was until she passed away, coming down to our center here in Manhattan to teach the language for what we believe is the first time in 400 years that the language has been taught. So despite there being just one native speaker of Lenape that is left, there is a kind of new revival movement that's happening with hundreds of revivalists who are trying to bring it back in Lenape places. So the story begins there, but then the arrival of the Dutch almost exactly 400 years ago kind of begins to set a new kind of multilingual template in the history of the emergent city. So, as I'm sure some of you will know, the kind of Dutch New Amsterdam was an unusual colony, completely distinct from the other 12. It was established more as a commercial entrepot than as a kind of English-only colony, as Massachusetts and Virginia essentially were. And within just the first few decades of the establishment of New Amsterdam, there were what I've calculated to be speakers of a few dozen different languages in a population of just several hundred. And that fact was already being sort of noted during the time. And it was a very particular kind of collection of languages as well. It was, European minority languages that were brought by settlers, the initial settlers who were working for the company or were somehow involved with the company. It was the languages brought by enslaved Africans who were brought here at an early date during the Dutch period. And it was Native American languages, including Lenape, which continued to have an important role at that point, as well as other neighboring visiting Native American languages that were here, such as Mohawk and Susquehannock. So, Dutch functioned as a lingua franca and played an important role and certainly survived for a long time. But actually, many of the first settlers were speakers of Walloon, for instance, which is a minority language today of France and Belgium. Peter Stuyvesant was from a Frisian-speaking background, which is a minority language of the Netherlands. And, there were at least a few speakers of just, a real variety of languages that kind of represented New York's, then New Amsterdam's, being situated right at the fulcrum of these 3 continents. This changes to an extent with the coming of the British. 1664, New Amsterdam becomes New York, and I won't go through the full linguistic history. But what I've tried to do in Language City is describe these kind of the way that the sort of multilingual template that was being set kind of went through ups and downs, but basically continued to deepen and intensify as time went on. Certainly in the 19th century, you have these very large waves of especially European non-English speaking immigrants from Germanic speaking lands a huge wave of Irish speakers as well around the time of the Great Famine, and that actually speakers of minority languages have consistently been overrepresented in the history of New York. And I think you would find this in the cases of other cities as well, and stories of migration, because simply they were the ones who had more reason to leave. And that actually a lens of language sheds new light on the city's history. And that if we kind of just see the history of New York or other cities in terms of their largest languages, which function as lingua francas certainly and have an important role, and maybe are more visible in terms of signage and writing and the historical record. But we're missing a lot if we fail to grasp the degree of especially oral language diversity that was characterizing New York and other cities, and that also informed many of its kind of deepest arrangements. How people lived here, the built environment, the professional trades, economic development, political system, that we sort of need to factor this into our understanding of the city's development and history. And then, of course, the sort of the role in the Ellis Island era of New York becoming this kind of first national economic and cultural capital, and then international economic capital, and that was fundamentally tied into what Ellis Island represented, which was that the city had this kind of crucial function as an immigrant gateway, that was kind of fundamental to its role on the national and international stage. And then this is kind of closed off in 1924, when it begins sort of the decline of Ellis Island. A major kind of anti-immigrant political wave hits, very similar resonances to now. And for about 40 years, in many ways, the country kind of closes its doors, and this changes New York as well. 1965, the Immigration Act that kind of reopens the U.S., and now this time even more so to the entire world, even if that wasn't sort of the full intention, or it happens gradually. And so we see then kind of in the last several decades, really this intensification and even spread of the kind of New York model that leads to the picture today, and why we established the Endangered Language Alliance, the presence of something like 10 or more percent of the world's linguistic diversity, including the arrival of languages from what linguists talk about as linguistic hotspots, places like the Himalaya, where I've done some linguistic work, indigenous zones of Latin America, particularly parts of Mexico, Guatemala, the Andes, West Africa as well. There are now over 100 languages of West Africa that are in New York. So it's the particular sort of stories of people coming from particular places, bringing their languages, and the recreation in microcosm of the linguistic diversity of entire regions that are now shrunk down to the size of a city neighborhood. So Brighton Beach as a kind of microcosm of the linguistic diversity of the Soviet Union. Jackson Heights, Queens, and the areas around it as a kind of microcosm of South Asian and Himalayan linguistic diversity. Harlem and the Bronx as a place where West African language diversity is kind of reconstituted in a way that it never has been in any single one place in West Africa, because languages that might be separated there by hundreds of miles or more are now within a few blocks of each other, leading to all kinds of interesting language contact situations. So there are many kind of things to study in here, and many ways to tell this story. What I try to do in the book is focus in on 6 speakers of languages from different parts of the world, including some of those linguistic hotspots, and tell their stories of migration from particular places, because again, the nation state lens is kind of doesn't go as deep as the linguistic lens in terms of giving us an understanding of where people are actually coming from. And of course, there's a multilingualism that is built in. It's not just that people are kind of bringing their mother tongues from an isolated place. In many cases, they're speaking 3, 4, 5, even 10 languages in the case of of one of the speakers that I profile. Yeah, I'm happy to sort of get more into the individual stories. But that there's a section of the book which is really about the lives of these six speakers and their language practices and how they're how they're using their languages in New York today, and how they're trying to defend their languages as well through teaching, through music, through cooking, through creating children's books, and a whole variety of other ways. So I hope that also kind of, yeah, after the sort of density of detail in the kind of historical part, that it also kind of brings alive what it's actually like in the streets of the parts of Queens, Brooklyn, and the Bronx, especially in the outer boroughs of New York, that and increasingly in the suburbs, that linguistic diversity is kind of deepest, because Manhattan is obviously kind of becoming too expensive for that. So then, the final section, it's kind of structured as past, present, and future, is about is about what's happening now, and whether this is peak diversity today. Will there ever be more linguistic diversity than there is today, or is this kind of is this it, given the threats that are mounting? So those are obviously very present today, having to do with immigration policy, which is at the heart of so much of this, the rising costs of city life, housing. It's an interesting question whether this sort of moves to other cities or to suburban areas or smaller cities. But it also has to do with the languages themselves and what's happening to the languages in their homelands. So it's, because language loss and language shift are now universal, and they're happening kind of almost everywhere as larger languages move in. So yeah, there's a lot more I could get into, but I wonder if I should kind of pause there to see what you guys feel like talking about, and whatever Katie and Caitlin think.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to kind of transition to more conversation. Gives folks a good sense of the lay of the land of the book. There's a lot to dive into, and a lot of things that I'm really excited to talk about. But first, I guess I'll start with this idea of like language as a lens through which to view New York as a city. I think, as those of us who work in preservation and are really enmeshed in like documenting the evolution and development of places, we're very much used to like viewing places and cities through different lenses, whether it's, immigration or urban renewal or public housing, or, even something more intangible like music. But language wasn't really I hadn't really thought about the evolution of city through language before. So that was a really interesting lens for me to that was a really interesting lens for me as a preservationist who's used to kind of exploring the evolution of cities, is to look at it through language. Because I can go into it. I think a lot of us preservationists can go into cities and kind of read the evolution of the city from the built environment. And so I imagine when you go into a city, whether it's like a neighborhood in New York or a city that's completely new to you, you're reading the city through maybe that language lens. I think at one point in the book you talk about like the awnings on outside of bodegas, and like the different language that you might see there. So I wonder, do you have that practice, like when you're in a city, in a neighborhood, of like kind of viewing it all through your professional lens of language?
I think in some ways it's a parallel process, but there are probably some interesting differences as well. So on the one hand, there is kind of a branch of linguistics called linguistic landscapes, where you're basically trying to sort of look at the signage in the built environment and understand what it's telling you linguistically. And that, can be as obvious as just, signage in other languages, but it can also be the way that multilingual signage is deployed as well. What what language is above the other, or how are they written, obviously the spelling of things. But a major limitation is that, as I said, most of the world's languages are traditionally oral. So you're not going to see them kind of hanging from from signs, excuse me. And you know what the sort of most clearly iconic kind of different language signage that we're used to is going to be in totally different writing systems and so on. But you know that there's a lot of overlap of writing systems and a lot of different languages where they're, you know, will be using a Latin-based writing system, and you know you won't necessarily, you know what you're looking at. But I'm also very interested in the names of businesses, sort of placemaking as well, and you know, obviously looking at personal names too, of course. Certainly, like listening to people. I mean, when there's nobody who's, you're not going to recognize every language, but you know, just sort of tuning in and like listening for language in different spaces. And really, it's primarily the oral, you know, the oral dimension that where more of that diversity is going to come out. But linguistic diversity is patterned, and that's part of what I kind of hope to sort of show. Maybe if I can, let me see if I can try to share my screen now for a minute, just to kind of show a little bit of the language mapping that we've done as well, related to this. There, you know, languages are not sort of randomly distributed around the city. They are in particular, you know, kind of structures. And as I said, there's sort of microcosms in some cases where, you know, more than half of all New Yorkers speak a language other than English at home. And that multilingualism is sort of everywhere. You know, you'll have, let's say, in, you know, that Brighton Beach I mentioned as this kind of post-Soviet linguistic microcosm, you'll have, you know, Russian as a kind of lingua franca, but then kind of within that, you go sort of a little bit deeper, you go into certain kinds of spaces, and you'll, you know, and it has to do with certain types of buildings and certain types of environments, obviously, too. You'll hear the languages of Central Asia, the languages of the Caucasus that come out in kind of smaller group settings, but may have large numbers of speakers. And then of course there are also a lot of languages which are still, you know, only really used in people's homes, or kind of even coming up sort of in their you know, in their own minds, because there are people who are kind of isolated as just one or a few speakers of their language. So if you can see, maybe now this is our print map that we kind of initially created, trying to kind of represent, which is a fool's errand and really tricky, the, you know, the kind of constant fluid nature of language in the city. And this is keyed to this is the result of years of work and thousands of conversations of a kind of linguistic census that we did here at the Endangered Language Alliance, because the regular census really does not capture much about language. There's really one question about language, and it's not designed to capture the multilingualism of a place like New York. So in our mapping, where, as I said, we've kind of identified over 700 languages, that's something like 5 times the total of what the US Census records around language. And there are a number of reasons we could get into around that, but basically what we then, you know, have done through well, endless walking around the city, but then also all these conversations with community leaders and speakers and language activists is build up this database of significant sites for language. They could be religious institutions, they could be cultural clubs, restaurants, residential kind of enclaves or individual buildings. In many cases, they are what are usually called like hometown associations, which are these clubs or groups that are set up by people from very particular places, often on the other side of the world, that people have migrated from, and that have a close connection to language because they're hyper local. And then that this is, you know, they have a rented room, or in some cases a building on a street in Queens or the Bronx, or maybe just be in somebody's apartment. But that in a way is kind of the sort of the map of those associations, which is part of this language map, is really kind of the sort of the deep immigrant map of the city. This is the digital version of the map that we then, well, I'll first zoom in on the print map a little bit just to show kind of a little what I'm talking about, where we have, the language name kind of in both the language and the writing system, as well as in kind of English. And the size is kind of based on the size of the community in these areas. So we're including larger languages that are certainly not endangered, but also kind of trying to make space for the smaller ones, because you certainly could, in terms of its extent, Dominican Spanish in Washington Heights it could take up the whole thing, but we're trying to sort of deliberately make space even for languages here that have smaller numbers of speakers in the sort of the design here. This is kind of Jackson Heights, Elmhurst in Queens. And then I hope you'll get a chance to take a look at the digital version of this, which is ever evolving. The print map we have available for donation to DLA, but the digital map is totally, free online and up to date, and has over now 750 language varieties mapped to over 1,200 different significant sites. So it is there is a connection with the built environment here, very much so, I think, and kind of neighborhood placemaking also that different groups are doing.
Yeah, and that's a theme that for me came up a lot in the book, is this interplay between language, place, and identity. And you talk a lot about the context in which a language exists and in which it's used, and how it seems that the physical context and space influences the evolution of the language, and that languages, you talk about, languages exerting a pull on one another. But then the flip side of that is you also talk about the language influencing the space around it as well. And this idea of kind of the unofficial creative placemaking. So I know we could talk about this all day, but like maybe for a minute, if you could just like touch on that idea of how language influences place and vice versa.
One thing I tried to collect is, all of as many as I could, the names that people use in their languages for different neighborhoods and landmarks and sites around the city. And I think, there's so much more that could be gathered there. A few of them maybe are familiar to a wider audience, like Loisaida, which is the sort of Puerto Rican Spanish name for the Lower East Side, which kind of puns off a place in Puerto Rico as well. But there are a lot of these, and there have been a lot historically as well. And they kind of, in different languages, they sort of define the spaces that people are kind of using and talking about, as well as the kind of reference points that people have to places often, on the other side of the world. So, I think that, we may tend to sort of see the city as just sort of in its English kind of street pattern. And of course, we know that some of those some of the names come from other languages, and that there are Lenape place names here, for instance. Of course, I talk about that whole situation. There are several hundred Lenape place names in the metropolitan or in the wider area, although some of them are kind of more dubious in terms of how they were kind of coined or corrupted over time. And others are just kind of hard to trace, but certainly are Lenape. But then there are, I think probably in some way, all of the languages that have passed through the city, or that are here now are influencing, at least for their speakers, how the city is kind of named and thought about and what the units are. So it's something that I think we need to kind of remember, not just the kind of course, there are certain streets that are now named in other languages, and there's been sporadic attempts to have, Chinese street signage in Chinatown and Manhattan, for instance. But beyond the sort of official kind of street names and even the official kind of business names, which can be in more languages and so on, there's a whole kind of world of reference which exists in many of these different languages as they've kind of tried to sort of make space here.
We have a question from the audience. I'll just read it out. It seems that the preservation of language could be fraught with political ramifications. People fear differences and others, often from skin color to language. How much of the loss of language can be attributed to this versus the speakers' other languages trying to fit in and discourage the use of their own language in favor of the dominant language?
Yeah, thank you for that. There is, I mean, the sort of the politics of linguistic diversity are complex all around. And certainly, there is a sort of a general situation where speakers of the larger languages, the written languages, the official languages, have in many cases not even recognized that sign languages, for instance, or minority languages, or many other languages, primarily oral languages, are even languages in the first place. So it's kind of, it's still common to hear people say, "Oh, that's just a broken dialect," or "Oh, that's not a real language." And from a linguistic point of view, that doesn't usually make sense in terms of the cognitive and communicative capacities. All of those 7,000 plus languages that I mentioned, as well as what we might call the many more dialects or varieties, is sort of equally able to communicate what its speakers have needed to communicate. And of course, borrowing words when necessary, and all languages borrow words from each other and borrow grammar. So there's a sort of deeper historical questions around, what people even consider to be sort of a proper language, or how people look down on certain languages. And those things are usually about the status of the speakers and the power relations that are there. And, politically, in some cases, it's been, some languages have been banned from being spoken at all. People have been punished pretty brutally for, speaking their languages in school. This happened in the US with the residential schools, where Native Americans were kind of pressured to send their children, and then the children had their languages, in some cases, even kind of beaten out of them. So that political background is very much kind of there. And when people come to a city like New York, it's they bring those things with them, and the sort of the language attitudes that are then internalized by speakers themselves, who say, well, this is, it's just a jargon, it's not a real language, I should speak a proper language. And so, in some cases, of course, communities are deciding or individuals are deciding that they, don't want to continue their language. They want to move to one that's more clearly advantageous. But it's not usually happening in a context of really balanced choice. It's happening with all of these enormous pressures kind of going on. So yeah, I think that the fears that people have about difference are certainly, are operative, and there have been moments where, even in New York, where it's so common to hear other languages and to be surrounded by other languages, that people react, against hearing another language. But I also think that language is something that it's a universal democratic fact of human life. Every group has a language. There's the sophistication, knowledge, poetry, and artistic kind of content in every language. So it's part of the the musical and artistic and intellectual traditions that make cities what they are. So I think by and large, it's kind of there has been a kind of such a kind of a strong through line in New York's history, certainly, of kind of understanding and support for a degree of linguistic and cultural difference. How far that goes is always an interesting question, but something like close to 35 to 40% of New Yorkers were born in another country. Most of the rest are the children or grandchildren of immigrants. And certainly language shift, as I say, has been universal here. It may happen at somewhat different rates. Is it in 2 or 3 or 4 generations? But people will often retain traces. It's part of New York City English as well, which we could talk about. People are shifting not just to English here, but also they're shifting from smaller languages to Spanish and to Russian and to French. So it's, I think linguistic difference is in some ways being more recognized in the city than before. And the last thing I'll mention about this in terms of the policy and kind of situation today is that there are now certain kind of language policy stipulations and protections in the last few decades that the city has implemented, and the state now is kind of following in that as well, and a few other states, where at least the 10 largest languages here, which have all kind of almost 100,000 speakers or many or more each, have some degree of protection at a very, I mean, protection is the wrong word perhaps, but like translation is mandated into, into those languages for key documents, and the city is expected to be able to, have city agencies do things in those languages. And there are now bilingual education programs of some kind, or dual language education in something like 13 different languages. Now, again, it's kind of at the margins, and English still remains a really dominant force. But I think these are all steps towards sort of making this Babel work, and that actually the sort of myth of Babel was overblown, or it's really just a myth in the Bible, and that actually multilingualism has had these tremendous benefits for the city and perhaps and for other places, and can be kind of grown and valued here.
So I guess switching gears a little bit, I'm curious how, if you have any thoughts as to how like preservation as a field, as a movement, preservationists as individuals might be able to be a resource for those who are working to save languages. Certainly there's growing belief in the preservation movement that the built environment is not the be all and end all, and especially for historically marginalized groups whose physical places may have been intentionally and systematically removed or destroyed, or groups who haven't had access to power to build things. It's all the more important for us as preservationists to celebrate and help preserve things that aren't beyond just the built environment. So I'm curious if you have any kind of early thoughts, as someone who's not enmeshed in the world of preservation, I guess what do, folks like yourself and people who speak these languages, what do you need? What's helpful in terms of resources? Like public awareness is something that's big in our world. But I know there's a few points in the book where, you talk about examples of that being, even detrimental. So, if you just talk about that.
Yeah, this is something I would really like to learn from all of you guys who are working in this area, who are connected with historic preservation in different ways. It seems to me that historic preservation of the built environment has a much kind of longer history, more experience, much more in terms of resources, and that's also now kind of evolving, towards the less tangible as well. Whereas I think, yeah, linguists, to a degree, we're sort of working with musicologists and others involved in kind of cultural preservation. But when we think of kind of language preservation, we're thinking about creating dictionaries and digital archives with recordings and maybe classes and children's books. And there's kind of a world of documentation, which is about, all of the questions around what it means to document a language before you even sort of get into the questions of language maintenance and revitalization and the actual continued use of languages, which of course is much more, fundamentally it's in the hands of speakers and communities, whereas documentation is a place where linguists have a, more clear kind of role to play. Public awareness is certainly good, and more of it is coming. But yes, it has its limitations, I think, and even in some cases is not what communities necessarily need most. I think that yeah, there's clearly a lot to learn, and I think it's what kinds of structures ensure continuity? I mean, once something is kind of there's an awareness that it should be preserved and measures are being taken, how does that play out over decades or centuries? I think we're so kind of new to this that we don't yet see what that trajectory over time could look like. How do you build public support around it? Not just kind of awareness, but like how do you get those who might not be, from the involved community or living on that block, or, to sort of to care and to think about, the preservation of something that's maybe not directly affecting them. How do you think about the trade-offs of, preservation vis-a-vis kind of new creation, I guess, or evolution, preserving something that's kind of, in a way that doesn't preserve it in amber, but allows it to have sort of continued development. I think that's, I think I'm thinking about that on the level of a dictionary or something like that, because it's like you create a dictionary and then people may sort of think that, okay, the language is in a book, here it is, it's done. But you really, you don't want, that's not a natural situation. A language should continue to evolve. And so how do you create dictionaries to sort of reflect that? But I'm sure there are analogous situations with the built environment. So I think there's a lot. There are a lot of questions that I have and would love some, good kind of reading list or conversations just to sort of open up our ears.
Yeah, just to begin the conversations, I think, between, folks in the language world and the built environment, because I just like throughout the book, it's just like so many parallels and analogies, the whole idea of preserving something in amber versus not, I kind of think the equivalent to that is like, most preservations don't want to save a building just for the sake of saving it, right? You want to save it so that it can be a vital contributing like part of a community so that people are using it. And, the trade-off is maybe you have to make some changes or remove some historic features to make that functional and vital building in a community. So yeah, I think there's a lot of ways, and then which they can, I can see, preservation is also about larger communities, not just individual buildings. So I can see language and all. There's just a lot. There's a lot to work with there, and I don't know. I'm kind of excited about, maybe this is the beginning of a conversation between preservationists and linguists and the people speaking the languages. I wonder how, community outreach and building relationships of trust is really important in the world of preservation and the built environment, and not something we've always been great at as preservationists. So I wonder how you navigate that. Are most people like coming to you, or are you like finding people? How do you navigate that space and do it in like a way where, you're being sensitive to that community and what their desires are?
Both things are happening. Certainly, lots of people come to us and they have an interest in something, an interest in a project, or they want to do something about their language in some way or other. And we, I think part of just being in the middle of New York City and not being just an academic institution. I mean, I teach as well at Columbia, but this is not something that I think academic linguistics has, is able to sort of take on, but really to be sort of just in the middle of the city as a kind of extended family of people who also belong to different communities and who are neighbors and who are artists and who have different skills. And media and all these things have kind of played into people finding us. But that said, the processes like mapping have also enabled us to meet lots of people and then propose and say, oh, wouldn't it be, oh, there's no dictionary for this language, or oh, we haven't seen any recordings. Oh, it'd be cool to have a recording in that language from a speaker in New York, and so it can happen in many different ways. And as I mentioned, we certainly there's no kind of way for a linguist to say like you should continue speaking your language or using your language. It's not. That's completely, up to those who speak it or are part of that community. And there's also many different ways to speak and different ideas of speakerhood, similarly with sign languages as well. But so it's kind of, it means that there's a different approach in every situation, and it kind of is like a menu, a kind of vast menu of possible options and ways that that could go. And it might be in a certain community that children's books are something needed or of interest. In another one, it's oral history recordings in their language. In another one, it's some kind of translation project or it's classes. So we try to kind of present some of those options and help kind of be a clearinghouse or a sounding board and a connector. It's like, oh, you want to do that? There's a certain piece of software. Oh, there's a fund you can apply to, for funding, or this is a tool that linguists can help build or something like that. So yeah, all of those things I think are there. It's just I think for communities, we recognize, of course, that really the first thing for so many communities is going to be about livelihood, putting food on the table, work, things like immigration status, health, and people, especially immigrants in a place like New York, are incredibly busy working 12-hour days, 16-hour days. So the desire, the interest is often there, but it's the question of like, okay, how do you sort of find the time to pass on a language or work on a language? And we're operating on a shoestring, and we can't sort of change the larger structures around us in a lot of cases. So we don't want to over promise, and there's no kind of you can set sort of concrete goals like we're going to do this children's book or we're going to create this dictionary, but it's an ongoing process, and we try to kind of just have a web of open-ended relationships that can go in different directions. And if there's not going to be a kind of monolithic community that is entirely involved in something, it's about relationships with individuals in person over time.
Yeah, again, lots of parallels.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's like an example that comes to mind of like a group or a community that's doing something creative and different or like public facing, like at the moment or in the recent past that you might want to highlight for us.
Sure. I talk about a number of different cases in the book. And as I said, I think hopefully, if you're not daunted by the 100+ pages of linguistic kind of history, although it's not super technical, it's more kind of history of New York through the lens of language. You then will get to the stories of these 6 speakers and the different things that they're doing, and that their communities are doing. But I guess one that comes to mind, because they are doing both kind of public facing and private facing or community facing things, that's interesting. As an example, could be the Sherpa community from Nepal. People might be familiar with the term Sherpa for a kind of famous mountaineer, the guides of Mount Everest. So the word Sherpa has even come into English, but it's actually an ethno-linguistic group from the kind of Nepal-Tibet border that has come to New York in large numbers. Thousands of Sherpas are in New York, especially in Queens. And among other things, they bought an old church several years ago, and I think did a wonderful act of I guess, a certain kind of historic preservation and transformation. So it was an old Lutheran church in the middle of kind of Jackson Heights, Elmhurst, that they have turned into a kind of Himalayan Buddhist style temple, which is totally open to to anybody, but it's become a real kind of Himalayan community center, not just a religious institution, but a place where speakers of dozens of different Himalayan languages will gather, elders, especially, but also younger people. And right down the block are the sort of offices of the Sherpa Hometown Association. They have all kinds of services for some of the several thousand Sherpas who live in the metropolitan area. I understand that they recently have also bought some land upstate to have as a kind of summer area, outdoors area for Sherpa gatherings and holidays and festivals, which other groups have done something similar. And they're just really thinking about intergenerational transmission. They're thinking both about sort of their group and its many languages, because there's Nepali, there's Tibetan, there's Sherpa, and there's English, and there's concern for each of them. That doesn't mean, I mean, it's a big challenge. It's hard to do all that, but I think they're doing a really interesting job of kind of thinking about cultural and linguistic preservation in the current environment. So
Great. Well, we're just about at time here, and I think to close us out, I'll just say you kind of touched on this, Ross, earlier. This idea that New York City has always been a city of immigrants, since the first Europeans set foot on Lenape shores. And so, I think it defines, immigrants define the city and its culture and economy. And I think that's really important fact for us to all remember. And I encourage everyone, if you haven't read the book, now that it's out in paperback, especially, go out and buy it. It was really fascinating. And those of you who are preservationists who are tuning in, I can attest, like it's just it's a different way for us as preservationists to approach cultural heritage and the history of a city. And I just really enjoyed it. So I want to thank you, Ross, and the Endangered Language Alliance, and all the folks you work with for all your really important work. And thank you for joining us.
thank
Katie,
you
I'll
so
turn it
much.
over to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you both for that conversation. Thank you, Russ, for taking the time to talk to the Preservation League's audience. Before we close it out, is there anything that you'd like to leave people with about your work, this book, other than just like borrow it from your library, buy it from bookshop, go read it however you choose to read it?
All of that. Thank you, Katie and Caitlin, and apologies again for the technical malfunction earlier on. But I'd love to hear from anybody who's a preservationist or preservation minded and would like to kind of jam on these issues. Check out the language map as well as a kind of another way in. I talk about it in the book, but yeah, I would just, like you to maybe in whatever way in your life, in your work, kind of add the lens of language to how you're seeing environments and situations. And, that we live in still a fundamentally multilingual world, very much a multilingual city and state. And of course, it can seem like it's a challenge, but also it's a huge opportunity, something to kind of embrace and value and wonder at. So I hope some sense of wonder also kind of emerges through Language City. But thanks again, everyone. Thanks to the League, and thanks to everyone for coming.